Hello and welcome to Muscles Part 3 screencast. So this is going to be control of muscles, and then we'll go into muscle metabolism. This one might be a little on the shorter side, we'll see. So the first thing you want to understand is what a motor unit is. This is the unit of control that your nervous system has over your muscles. So it is defined as A, meaning one motor neuron, and all of the muscle fibers it supplies. So if you look here, this motor neuron has its cell body or its beginning in the spinal cord, and then it goes out through a nerve and it splits. It controls these two muscle fibers. So these two muscle fibers plus that motor neuron is this motor unit. And then over here you have a different motor neuron, which also originates in the gray matter of the spinal cord. And it, in the periphery, splits and controls or innervates these four individual muscle fibers. So this is a different, slightly larger motor unit. So this is what your central nervous system or your brain can control, is motor neurons, not muscle fibers. So your brain activates motor units, and then the motor units control discrete numbers of muscle fibers. So it's very important to remember this. This is how your brain works, by recruiting motor units, not necessarily individual muscle fibers. Generally speaking, those muscles that are smaller, that you have finer control over, have small motor units. So if you have lots of small motor units, you can increase the amount of force that you're generating in small increments. If you have large motor units, which are found in your larger muscles, then you don't have as fine a control over the amount of force that you're generating. It's sort of the exact opposite of the weight plates that you might put on a bar at the gym. If you've got nothing but 45 and 35 pound plates, then you can't increase the weight in small increments. But if you've got 10, 5, and 2.5 pound plates, you can fine tune exactly how much weight you want to put on the bar. Same thing with motor units. So this then, if you increase the weight on the bar by putting more weights on it, your central nervous system increases the amount of force it is recruiting, I guess, or the amount of force put out by a muscle by recruiting more motor units. So anytime any individual muscle fiber contracts, it contracts as hard as it can under those circumstances. So your brain doesn't tell an individual muscle fiber to work harder. What it does is recruit more motor neurons and therefore more motor units. So if you're lifting a light weight, maybe it's just this blue motor unit and the fibers within that fascicle are enough to move a light weight. As the weight gets heavier, your brain recruits more and more motor neurons and therefore more motor units. So you always want to think of any individual motor unit contraction or muscle fiber contraction as being, for the most part, all or nothing. It either contracts 100% or not at all. This is generally how your body's physiology works. If you have access to fancy lab equipment and you can electronically stimulate muscles and have finer control over muscles than we usually have just with our brains, then you can get stuff like a muscle twitch. So this is a graph of a muscle twitch. You want to equate this with, let's say, if we go back up here, how far back do I have to go to get the picture I want? Right. Let's imagine one nerve impulse. So one action potential travels down this neuron, and this synaptic cleft, or axon terminal, I should say, releases 5 vesicles. So it's just enough acetylcholine to get one end plate potential, one action potential in the muscle cell, and one little squirt of calcium into the cytoplasm. So if we go back down here again, so this is one little drop of acetylcholine is what that red arrow is supposed to indicate. And this is how your nervous system works, by discrete releases of acetylcholine. So this would be, again, just one nerve impulse, one drop of acetylcholine from a motor neuron. You get, first, nothing happens in the muscle cell, or excuse me, no tension is generated. That is the latent period. So this is the time it takes from when the acetylcholine hits the surface of the cell to when the myosin and actin actually engage with each other. That's the latent period. The contraction period is when myosin is pulling on the actin, and then relaxation begins when calcium starts getting pumped back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So this would be, again, if you could just do one little dropper of acetylcholine. Generally in the lab, what it is just one zap of just enough electricity to depolarize a muscle cell the same way acetylcholine would. So also here with TREP, you're generally only going to get something that looks like this in the lab. So each arrow represents one drop of acetylcholine or one zap of electricity, and you want to envision either the same amount of electricity or the same amount of acetylcholine every time, and you're letting the muscle completely relax every time in between stimuli. If you stimulate it at a high enough frequency, the strength of the contraction or the amount of tension generated in each one of those twitches goes up a little bit. That is called TREP. It is thought that continued stimulation over time leads to a more efficient release of calcium. So the same stimulation at the motor end plate or the same depolarization from electrical shock leads to more calcium being released, and then you get a stronger contraction. Again, your muscles generally don't do this. And your muscles generally don't do this either. So if the single bouts of stimulation or individual drops of acetylcholine come close enough together that the muscle fiber doesn't get to fully relax in between stimuli, then you get a ratcheting up of the tension, because again, it doesn't fully relax and then you contract again, and so you're generating tension on top of the tension that you had already generated. If you put continued drops of acetylcholine or sequential drops of acetylcholine on the muscle, one right after another, right after another, right after another, such that the muscle never relaxes at all, and you keep it almost completely depolarized the whole time, and a stable amount of high levels of calcium in the cytoplasm, you get something that looks like this. So the the calcium levels never drop off, so you get the same amount of tension for the entirety of the contraction. That is tetanus. And this is generally what your muscles do, right? If you go to make a movement, you're going to pick something up, do a push-up, whatever. Your brain calculates how much force it thinks it's going to need and just performs a full-on tetanus contraction. If it's enough force, then it just goes on like that. If it's not enough force, you might have to try again. But this is generally, as I understand it, how your nervous system and muscles interact in the real world. And then you just want to envision the whole time during tetanus, those arrows are still coming. So if you're holding plank, right, which is kind of like the top of a push-up, if you're not familiar with plank, But if you're holding a plank or the top of a push-up for a minute, then your motor neurons are releasing a steady drop, 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 drop of acetylcholine onto your muscle for that entire minute, so it never fully relaxes. That's tetanus. Now we are on to muscle metabolism. Oh, this one is going to be relatively brief. I don't know if I have reinforced this enough this semester, but ATP, adenosine triphosphate, is the primary energy currency that your cells use. So any reaction or process going on in the cell that requires energy generally uses ATP to produce that energy. So you split adenosine triphosphate into adenosine diphosphate plus an inorganic phosphate, which just means it's PO3. There's no carbon, so we call it inorganic. So your muscles are the same. You might eat fat, carbs, or protein, but those molecules are broken down by your body, and the energy from your fat, your carbs, and your protein is used to synthesize ATP, and ATP is what your cells run on. So there are, whoops, didn't mean to do that, 3 different mechanisms or 3 different metabolic pathways that your muscles can use to generate more ATP once they run out of ATP. And I think your muscles have enough ATP, oh, it's in the previous slide, 4 to 6 seconds. So not a lot. So it's aerobic respiration, anaerobic respiration, and just a direct transfer of a phosphate from creatine phosphate to adenosine diphosphate. So if we look at aerobic metabolism, this is it in a nutshell. We are not going to go through all of the steps. It is actually a very long, quite complicated, but totally cool process. So you start with glucose, which has 6 carbons in it. If you have oxygen present, the glucose and the oxygen react to form 6 molecules of water, 6 CO2 molecules, so these are the 6 carbons from your glucose, plus 33 ATP. And we'll just leave it at that. So generally speaking, looking at this figure here, we're going to start with glucose. You can start with other things in the mitochondria and get different amounts of ATP. But for 33 ATP, that comes from glucose. Pyruvic acid and fatty acids would give different amounts of ATP. So the benefit of the aerobic pathway is that it is very efficient, meaning that your glucose yields a lot of ATP, and because your metabolic byproducts are water and CO2, both of which are quite easy to get rid of, you can do this for a long time, hours or even days, right? You could walk for over 24 hours if you absolutely had to, and some people run for 24 hours or more. These somewhat crazy people that run ultra marathons of 100 miles or more. So that's the benefit, is that it's super efficient, and as long as you've trained, you can do it for a long time. The major drawback is that it is rate limited by how quickly your body can deliver oxygen to your muscles. So it is rate limited by blood delivery of oxygen. This makes it the slowest out of the 3 ways that your muscles can use to regenerate their ATP stores. So then you get to your aerobic pathway. This is what your muscles switch to when your body can't deliver oxygen to the muscle fast enough for the mitochondria to work. So without oxygen, you can't use your mitochondria. So then what you're doing is you're just taking your glucose and breaking it down into 2 3-carbon molecules, actually 2 carbon molecules, excuse me, and those are called pyruvate or pyruvic acid, which then gets turned into lactic acid. You can't tell from looking at this versus that, but this is a much, much shorter and quicker process than this. So even though when you do this, every time you break down glucose, you only get 2 ATP, you can run this process so quickly, you can actually produce ATP faster this way than you can when you use your mitochondria and your oxygen. So that's the primary benefit of your anaerobic pathway, is that it's faster than your aerobic pathway. The drawbacks are that, one, it's less efficient. Each glucose only yields 2 ATP, so you're going to run out of glucose quickly, which would cause fatigue. Two, that pyruvate here gets turned into lactic acid. The lactic acid builds up in the muscle. That causes the burn and the discomfort, which also leads to fatigue. So you can't employ your anaerobic pathway as long as you can your aerobic pathway. How long you can go anaerobic depends on how well trained you are and how fast you're going. If you're just barely into your anaerobic pathway, if you're not going almost all out, then you're not going to generate quite as much lactic acid. You might be able to go anaerobic for 15 to 20 minutes. If you're going close to your maximum, you might only be able to go anaerobic for a minute or two. It just depends. Then you have creatine phosphate. This is just as simple as it looks. You have creatine phosphate, which is this molecule called creatine. We don't need to know what it looks like, with a phosphate attached to it. And it's one-step chemical reaction. You transfer the phosphate from creatine to adenosine diphosphate, and you regenerate your adenosine triphosphate. The benefit of this is that it is the fastest out of all three, the fastest way to regenerate or generate new ATP. The drawback is that it's only good for 5 to 15 seconds. Your cells just generally don't store a lot of creatine phosphate for reasons that I don't really understand. So you can only do that for a little while. And generally what happens when you start a bout of exercise is that your muscles plow through their creatine phosphate stores first, because that's the simplest thing to do. And then depending on how intensely you're exercising, they will switch either to aerobic or anaerobic. If you are an athlete and you've wondered whether or not you should take a creatine phosphate supplement, it is one of the supplements that, from what I have read, does actually improve performance. There are two caveats to that. It will improve short burst activity performance. So if you're a distance athlete, it's probably not going to help you very much. But if you're an explosive athlete, you're looking for speed, or you're looking for an edge in the gym to get, one extra repetition on your bench press or something, it might help with that. You just need to read up, because when you take it, you're increasing the amount of creatine phosphate that you have available in your muscle cells. And what's going to happen is that over time, your body is going to recognize that it's got more creatine phosphate than it normally does, and it'll stop making its own creatine phosphate, and then your creatine phosphate levels will drop back down to normal again. So like some other performance-enhancing drugs, or just performance enhancers, you have to cycle on and off of it. That's it. I will say for each of the pathways, this is how you want to think about them. What's good about this energy-producing pathway, and what's bad about this energy-producing pathway. And keep all of that in mind, and I'll just basically ask you a bunch of questions about which is the fastest way to generate ATP, which way lasts the longest, which causes the production of lactic acid, all of that stuff. That's all the important stuff. One little more bit I'll throw in there. That lactic acid burn is only when you're exercising. If you are sore the next day, that's not lactic acid. It is long gone. That is soreness from other chemicals that get released when you overuse or damage your muscles a little bit. Mild overuse is what exercise is good. Your body responds to it by rebuilding stronger. So if you're sore the next day, that's great. But that is not lactic acid. That is other chemicals that your muscles release when you push them a little bit past their limits. That's it. Thanks.